Everything you know is a fabrication, a carefully constructed deception passed down through generations like poison in a lullaby. They fed you the story of a wooden puppet dreaming of humanity. Disney draped Pinocchio in innocent pastels and harmless mischief. A charming little liar whose penalty was merely a stretching nose, whose sins dissolved into sugary redemption beneath twinkling stars. That sanitized fable lives in your childhood memories. That comfortable lie has nothing to do with the truth. Because the real Pinocchio? The original Pinocchio was something far darker. Something they desperately needed you to forget. The real story begins not with cricket songs and wishing stars, but with the creak of hemp rope under the weight of a child's body. It begins with the systematic execution of Italy's unwanted, the orphaned, the hungry, the disobedient. It begins with Carlo Collodi, writing in 1883, embedding into his tale the very real trauma of watching children die at the end of a noose, their small necks snapping like kindling in the public squares of Tuscany. You have been told a fairy tale. What follows is an autopsy. The year is 1860. The morning air in the hills outside Florence carries the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic and wrong. It clings to the back of your throat like copper pennies dissolved in rainwater. This is the smell of blood that has soaked into soil and dried, then been dampened again by the endless cycle of Tuscan weather. This is the smell that rises from the base of every gallows tree, where the earth has been fed a steady diet of human suffering. Walk with me through these streets, but do not expect cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of gentle footfall. The roads are rivers of mud mixed with animal waste, human excrement, and the detritus of a society that discards its weakest members like broken pottery. Your feet sink into this paste with each step, and the squelch follows you like a heartbeat. The sound echoes off the narrow walls of buildings that lean into each other like drunken mourners, their facades stained with decades of soot and neglect. In the cramped tenements that line these streets, families of 8 or 10 press themselves into single rooms, no larger than a modern closet. The air inside is thick with the exhalations of too many lungs, the sweet, sick smell of unwashed bodies, and the acrid tang of chamber pots that cannot be emptied often enough. Children sleep 3 to a bed, when there is a bed at all. More often, they curl together on floors of packed dirt, sharing threadbare blankets that offer little protection against the cold that seeps through walls built without mortar, held together by hope and habit. These children wake not to the promise of school or play, but to the immediate demand of survival. Boys as young as 6 are sent to work in the textile mills that line the Arno River, their small fingers perfect for threading the narrow spaces between machinery that would crush an adult hand without pause. The factories fill with the rhythmic clatter of looms and the higher, more desperate sound of children's voices calling out when the machines catch flesh instead of thread. The air inside these buildings is white with cotton dust that settles in young lungs like snow that never melts. Girls fare no better. They are sent to work as servants in the grand villas that dot the Tuscan countryside, their days beginning before dawn with the lighting of fires and the hauling of water from wells that may be contaminated with the runoff from nearby graveyards. They scrub floors with lye soap that burns their hands raw, and they learn to move through the houses of their betters like ghosts, seen only when needed, silent always, invisible when their presence might offend the delicate sensibilities of those who own them in all but name. But it is the children who cannot or will not submit to this grinding routine who concern us most. The ones who steal bread because their stomachs have been empty for days. The ones who lie about their age to avoid the factories, or about their parentage to claim some small inheritance. The ones who run away from masters who beat them, or who speak back to authorities who demand their silence. These are the children who find themselves standing before magistrates in courtrooms that smell of old wood and older prejudices, where justice is measured not in scales, but in the social standing of the accused. The law in 1860s Tuscany is not blind. It sees very clearly the difference between the children of merchants and the children of no one. When a young nobleman is caught stealing, it is called youthful indiscretion. When a street child takes the same item, it is called theft, and theft is a hanging offense. The courtrooms echo with the sound of gavels falling like executioners' axes, each strike sealing the fate of another small body. Public executions in this era are not the swift, clinical affairs that modern minds might imagine. They are theater, carefully choreographed performances designed to extract maximum terror from both the condemned and the watching crowd. The gallows are erected in the central piazzas, where the maximum number of citizens can witness what befalls those who transgress against the social order. The wood used for these structures is often green, chosen specifically because it will creak and groan under weight, adding an auditory element to the visual spectacle of death. The condemned child, and they are often children, because childhood offers no protection from the law's hunger, is led through streets lined with spectators who have gathered as if for a festival. Some come out of genuine bloodlust, others from morbid curiosity. But most attend because absence might be interpreted as sympathy for the condemned, and sympathy is its own form of transgression. The crowd presses close enough to smell the fierce sweat that pours from the small figure at the center of this procession, a scent sharp and sour like vinegar mixed with salt. At the gallows, there is a moment of terrible intimacy between the condemned and the crowd. The child's eyes, wide with terror and disbelief, scan the faces of those who have come to watch death. Sometimes there is a parent in that crowd, held back by neighbors or constables, their mouth open in a scream that cannot be heard over the murmur of the assembled masses. More often, there is no one. These children die as they lived, alone, unwanted, forgotten before they are even gone. The rope itself is rough hemp, chosen for its strength rather than its kindness. When it is placed around a child's neck, it scratches against skin that may never have known a gentle touch. The texture is coarse, like the bark of a tree, and it leaves marks even before it begins its final work. The executioner, often a local man paid a few coins for his services, pulls the noose tight with hands that have performed this task so many times that the motion has become mechanical, divorced from any consideration of the humanity of his victim. The drop, when it comes, is rarely clean. These are not the calculated falls of later, more humane executions. The child simply swings, feet kicking at air that offers no purchase, hands clawing at the rope that tightens with each struggle. The crowd watches as the small body convulses, as the face turns purple, as the eyes bulge and then, finally, go still. The silence that follows is broken only by the creak of rope and wood, a sound that will haunt the dreams of witnesses for years to come. But death by hanging, brutal as it is not the worst fate that awaits transgressing children in this time and place. For those whose crimes are deemed particularly heinous, or whose executions are meant to send a stronger message, there is the mazzatello. This ancient form of execution involves the use of a heavy mace to crush the skull of the condemned. The sound it makes when it connects with bone is unlike anything else in the natural world, a wet crack that seems to echo from the very stones of the piazza. Blood sprays in arcs that catch the morning light, painting the faces of the nearest spectators with drops that are still warm. The smell that rises from these execution sites is complex and nauseating. There is the metallic scent of fresh blood, sharp and clean at first, but quickly turning cloying as it begins to coagulate. There is the earthier smell of bowels released in death, a reminder that even in its final moments, the body continues its most basic functions. And underneath it all, there is something else. The smell of fear itself, acrid and animal, that seems to seep from the very stones where so much terror has been concentrated. These are the sights, sounds, and smells that filled Carlo Collodi's world as he began to write the story that would become Pinocchio. These are the images that haunted the nightmares of every child who grew up in this time and place. When Collodi wrote of a puppet who was hanged for his transgressions, he was not creating fantasy. He was documenting reality, embedding in his tale the very real trauma of a society that fed its children to the machinery of social control. The original Pinocchio story, published in serial form beginning in 1881, ended with the puppet's death by hanging. There was no redemption, no transformation into a real boy, no happy reunion with Geppetto. There was only the image of a small figure swaying from a tree, a victim of his own inability to conform to the expectations of a world that had no place for the different, the disobedient, or the desperate. This is the story that was buried beneath layers of sanitization and commercialization. This is the truth that Disney's animators painted over with bright colors and cheerful songs. But the original darkness remains, embedded in the very DNA of the tale, waiting to be excavated by those willing to dig beneath the surface of our comfortable lies. The children of 1860s Tuscany, who died at the end of ropes and under the weight of maces, were not characters in a story. They were real human beings whose lives were cut short by a system that valued order over mercy, conformity over compassion. Their names are lost to history, their graves unmarked, their stories untold. But their deaths echo through the pages of Pinocchio, a reminder that our most beloved fairy tales often grow from soil that has been watered with blood. The Italian judicial system of the 19th century operated as a machine of calculated terror, its gears lubricated with the blood of children and the desperate. This was not the work of deranged individuals acting in shadow, but a methodical apparatus of state-sanctioned brutality that functioned with the precision of clockwork and the moral vacancy of a plague. The true architects of horror were not masked killers lurking in alleyways, but judges in robes, executioners with official commissions, and a legal framework that transformed murder into ceremony. In the Papal States and Tuscan regions, justice wore the mask of divine authority while wielding the tools of systematic cruelty. The courts operated under a tiered system of punishment that correlated directly with social status and economic position. A nobleman caught stealing might face a fine or brief imprisonment, while a vagrant child accused of the same crime would find themselves dragged to the scaffold. This was not justice perverted by corruption, but justice functioning exactly as designed, a mechanism for maintaining social order through the strategic application of terror. The executioners who carried out these sentences were not monsters born from nightmare, but ordinary men performing their duties with the same methodical attention to detail that a carpenter might bring to building a chair. Giovanni Battista Bugatti, the most notorious of these state-employed killers, approached his work with professional pride. He maintained his tools with meticulous care, sharpening blades to surgical precision and testing ropes for optimal tension. His ledgers, preserved in Vatican archives, record each execution with bureaucratic thoroughness. The victim's name, age, crime, method of death, and duration of suffering. Bugatti's preferred method was the mazzatello, a technique that combined the psychological impact of public spectacle with the practical efficiency of reliable death. The condemned would be forced to kneel on the scaffold, while Bugatti positioned himself behind them, a heavy iron mace weighing approximately 4 pounds gripped in both hands. The crowd would fall silent as he raised the weapon, the metal catching sunlight like a grotesque benediction. The first blow was calculated to incapacitate without killing. A precise strike to the base of the skull that would shatter the occipital bone and send fragments of calcium carbonate into the brain tissue like shrapnel. The sound of that initial impact carried across the piazza with the sharp crack of breaking timber, followed immediately by the wet compression of tissue and the hollow echo of metal striking bone. Witnesses described a sound like a melon dropping onto stone, but with an underlying musical note. The resonance of iron against calcium that seemed to hang in the air long after the blow had landed. The victim would collapse forward, their nervous system sending chaotic signals through damaged neural pathways, causing limbs to twitch and convulse in patterns that bore no resemblance to voluntary movement. But death rarely came with that first strike. The Mazzatello method required the victim to remain conscious for the final phase of execution, a deliberate prolonging of agony designed to maximize the psychological impact on witnesses. As the condemned lay writhing on the scaffold, blood pooling beneath their shattered skull, Bugatti would draw a long knife from his belt. The blade, honed to razor sharpness, would slice through the carotid artery with surgical precision, releasing a pressurized spray of arterial blood that painted the scaffold planks in arterial red. The medical reality of this process reveals the calculated cruelty embedded in its design. The initial mace blow would typically fracture the skull without penetrating deeply enough to cause immediate death. Instead, it would create what modern forensic pathologists recognize as a depressed skull fracture with associated intracranial hemorrhaging. The victim would experience what neurologists now understand as a traumatic brain injury, characterized by severe disorientation, loss of motor control, and excruciating pain as damaged neurons fired randomly throughout the cranial cavity. The broken bone fragments would press against the brain tissue, causing localized swelling and increased intracranial pressure. This would manifest as severe headache, nausea, and progressive loss of consciousness, but not immediate death. The victim would remain aware of their surroundings while losing the ability to control their body, trapped in a prison of damaged flesh as their life slowly leaked away through fractured bone and torn tissue. When Bugatti finally drew his knife across the throat, he was performing what amounted to a mercy killing, ending suffering that could have continued for hours or even days. The carotid artery, when severed completely, would empty the brain of oxygenated blood within 60 to 90 seconds. The victim would experience a rapid dimming of consciousness as their neural tissue, starved of oxygen, began the process of cellular death that would spread throughout their body like a tide of molecular collapse. Hanging, the alternative method of execution favored in rural areas where trained executioners were unavailable, presented its own catalog of horrors. The popular imagination pictures hanging as a quick snap of the neck followed by immediate death. But this sanitized version bears no resemblance to the reality of 19th-century Italian executions. The drop-hanging technique, which could indeed cause instantaneous death through cervical fracture, required precise calculations of rope length, victim weight, and drop distance that were beyond the knowledge of local authorities. Instead, victims were typically suspended from tree branches or crude gallows using ropes that slowly tightened around their necks as their body weight pulled them downward. This method, known as suspension hanging, caused death through a combination of compression of the carotid arteries, obstruction of the jugular veins, and gradual closure of the trachea. The process could take anywhere from 3 to 15 minutes, during which the victim remained conscious and aware of their approaching death. The physiological sequence of suspension hanging follows a predictable pattern that has been documented in forensic literature with clinical precision. As the noose tightens around the neck, it first compresses the external jugular veins, preventing blood from flowing away from the brain. This causes the face to become engorged with blood, turning a deep purple color as capillaries burst under increased pressure. The victim's eyes bulge from their sockets as intraocular pressure builds, and small hemorrhages appear in the conjunctiva like crimson stars against the white of the eye. Simultaneously, the rope begins to compress the carotid arteries, reducing the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain. The victim experiences a sensation described by survivors as a rushing sound in their ears, followed by tunnel vision as their peripheral sight fails. Their hands and feet begin to tingle as circulation becomes compromised, and they feel an overwhelming urge to struggle against the rope even as their strength ebbs away. The compression of the trachea occurs gradually as the victim's weight settles and the noose tightens. Unlike the dramatic gasping portrayed in fiction, the actual process involves a slow reduction in airway diameter that makes breathing increasingly labored. The victim can still draw small amounts of air, but not enough to sustain consciousness. They experience the sensation of drowning while suspended in air, their lungs burning as carbon dioxide builds up in their bloodstream. As oxygen levels in the brain drop below critical thresholds, the victim enters a state of hypoxic euphoria, a neurological phenomenon where dying brain cells trigger the release of endorphins and other neurotransmitters. This creates a paradoxical sense of peace and well-being even as the body shuts down. Witnesses often noted that struggling victims would suddenly become still, their faces relaxing into what appeared to be serene acceptance. This was not spiritual transcendence, but the biochemical signature of neural death. The final moments of consciousness involve a cascade of neurological failure as different brain regions shut down in sequence. The victim loses control of their bladder and bowels as the autonomic nervous system fails, releasing waste that drips onto the scaffold below. Their limbs twitch and convulse as dying motor neurons fire their last signals, creating the illusion of continued struggle long after consciousness has fled. Death, when it finally arrives, comes not as a single moment, but as a gradual cessation of biological function. The heart may continue beating for several minutes after breathing stops, pumping deoxygenated blood through a circulatory system that no longer serves any purpose. Brain death occurs in stages, with higher cognitive functions failing first, followed by basic motor control, and finally the primitive brainstem functions that regulate breathing and heart rate. The bodies left hanging as warnings to the community underwent their own transformation in death. Rigor mortis would set in within 2 to 6 hours, causing the corpse to stiffen in whatever position it had assumed during the final moments of life. The rope would continue to tighten as tissues dried and contracted, sometimes causing partial decapitation as the head separated from the body under its own weight. Decomposition in public display followed a predictable pattern influenced by weather, temperature, and local scavengers. In warm weather, bacterial action would begin within hours, causing the abdomen to distend with gases produced by putrefaction. The skin would take on a greenish tint as hemoglobin broke down into sulfhemoglobin, and fluids would begin to leak from body orifices, creating dark stains on the scaffold below. Insects would arrive in waves, first the blowflies, attracted by the scent of death, followed by beetles and other carrion feeders. Maggots would appear within days, consuming soft tissues with methodical efficiency. The process of skeletonization could take weeks or months, depending on environmental conditions and whether local authorities eventually removed the remains. The psychological impact of these public executions extended far beyond the immediate horror of witnessing death. Children who attended these spectacles, and attendance was often mandatory for educational purposes, carried the trauma throughout their lives. Medical records from the period document cases of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, recurring nightmares, sudden episodes of terror triggered by specific sounds or smells, and a persistent fear of authority figures. The sensory memories proved particularly persistent. The creaking of rope under tension would trigger panic attacks decades later when victims heard similar sounds from ship rigging or construction equipment. The metallic scent of blood, once experienced in the concentrated form present at executions, would be immediately recognizable even in small quantities, causing survivors to flee butcher shops or avoid medical procedures. The sound of breaking bone, that distinctive crack that accompanied the mazzatello, became embedded in witnesses' auditory memory with such precision that they could distinguish it from other similar sounds with disturbing accuracy. Veterans of multiple executions developed an almost supernatural ability to predict the exact moment of death based on subtle changes in the victim's breathing or the angle of their suspended body. The Italian authorities understood and deliberately exploited this psychological scarring. The goal was not simply to punish individual criminals, but to create a population so thoroughly terrorized that they would police themselves rather than risk facing the scaffold. Every public execution was a lesson in the consequences of challenging social order, delivered with the pedagogical precision of a university lecture and the lasting impact of severe trauma. The system succeeded precisely because it was systematic. Unlike random violence, which people can rationalize as aberrant, state-sanctioned execution carried the weight of inevitability. Citizens learned that the machinery of justice, once set in motion, would grind forward with mechanical certainty until flesh was reduced to carrion and life was transformed into warning. This was the true horror of 19th-century Italian justice, not the work of madmen, but the methodical application of terror by rational actors pursuing logical goals. The screams that echoed through the piazzas were not the random cries of victims caught in chaos, but the precisely orchestrated symphony of a system functioning exactly as designed. July 7, 1881. Florence awakens to another scorching summer morning. The cobblestones of Via dei Calzaiuoli already radiate heat as Carlo Collodi sits at his wooden desk, ink-stained fingers poised over blank paper. Outside his window, the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore toll 6 times. He dips his pen and begins to write the first words of what will become humanity's most devastating lie disguised as children's literature. The Giornale per I Bambini awaits his serial. Children across Italy will soon read about a wooden puppet who dreams of becoming real. But Collodi knows something his young readers do not. 3 blocks away, in the shadow of the Palazzo del Bargello, the gallows still stand. The rope still hangs. The executioner still draws his wages. By noon, Collodi has written the opening chapters. A lonely woodcarver creates a son from pine. The puppet comes alive, filled with hope and mischief, innocent enough. But already, in Collodi's mind, the ending crystallizes. He has seen too many small bodies swaying in the Tuscan wind. He has watched too many crowds gather to witness justice served upon the poor, the desperate, the forgotten. The puppet will hang because that is what happens to those who dare to dream beyond their station. July 25th arrives with the merciless heat that only Tuscan summers can deliver. Chapter 15. Collodi's hand trembles slightly as he writes the words that will haunt literature forever. The fox and the cat. Those perfect embodiments of predatory authority corner the innocent puppet. They are not mythical creatures. They are every corrupt official, every cruel magistrate, every adult who profits from the suffering of children. The rope goes around Pinocchio's neck at precisely 2 in the afternoon, literary time. But this moment echoes countless real afternoons when real ropes encircled real necks. The records are there, buried in the archives of Italian justice. Between 1800 and 1889, hundreds of children met their end at the gallows. Their crimes? Theft of bread, vagrancy, the audacity of existing while poor. Collodi writes with surgical precision, "They threw the rope over a high limb of an oak tree and pulled him up. No euphemism, no gentle metaphor. The puppet kicks for 3 hours, eyes wide open, experiencing the slow strangulation that was the reality of public execution. This is not fiction. This is documentation. The oak tree becomes a monument to institutional cruelty. Every branch represents another life, cut short by a system that viewed poverty as a crime punishable by death. The puppet's suffering is not symbolic. It is testimonial." Collodi transforms the gallows into literature, but the gallows remain. 3 hours. 180 minutes of slow death, witnessed by the forest creatures who represent the silent complicity of society. They watch. They do nothing. They normalize the horror until it becomes just another story to tell children at bedtime. As evening falls over Florence on that July day, Collodi sets down his pen. He has created something unprecedented, a children's story that refuses to lie about the world children actually inhabit. A tale that acknowledges the rope waiting for every child born into the wrong circumstances. But he also knows what will happen to his truth. Time will soften it. Publishers will sanitize it. Eventually, a corporation built on manufactured innocence will strip away every uncomfortable reality and replace it with songs about wishing upon stars. The hanging will become a brief moment of peril, quickly resolved by a fairy's intervention. The puppet will learn his lesson, become a real boy, and live happily ever after. But the original ending remains, buried like a corpse beneath layers of revisionist sentiment. Pinocchio hangs. The story ends. No resurrection. No redemption. Just the simple, brutal truth that the world destroys those who dare to be different, who refuse to conform, who believe they deserve more than the station assigned to them at birth. The real tragedy is not what happened to a fictional puppet. The real tragedy is what happened to the story itself. We took Collodi's unflinching examination of systemic violence and transformed it into a celebration of obedience. We taught children that if they just behave, if they just listen to authority, if they just suppress their natural impulses, they too can become real. But becoming real, in the sanitized version, means becoming complicit. It means accepting a world where some children hang while others sing. It means embracing the lie that suffering serves a purpose, that punishment leads to redemption, that the system works if you just work hard enough to deserve its mercy. The Disney Corporation understood something profound about human nature when they rewrote Collodi's ending. We cannot bear the truth of our own cruelty. We cannot face the reality of what we do to the innocent. So we invent fairy godmothers and happy endings. We create elaborate mythologies of justice and redemption to obscure the simple fact that we are the fox and the cat, and we always have been. Every time a parent reads the sanitized version to their child, they participate in the great conspiracy of forgetting. Every time we celebrate Pinocchio's transformation into a real boy, we erase the memory of all the real boys who never got that chance. We make their deaths invisible by making their story palatable. The puppet hanging from the oak tree is not a metaphor for growing up or learning responsibility. It is a literal representation of what happens when society decides that certain lives have no value. The rope around Pinocchio's neck is the same rope that ended hundreds of young lives in 19th century Italy. The only difference is that the puppet's death was written down, preserved, and then systematically obscured by our collective need to believe in happy endings. We are the inheritors of this violence, and we are its perpetuators. Every time we choose comfort over truth, every time we prioritize innocence over justice, every time we allow the sanitized version to eclipse the original, we participate in the ongoing murder of memory itself. The oak tree still stands, metaphorically speaking. The rope still hangs, and somewhere, in the space between what we remember and what we choose to forget, the puppet continues to kick, eyes wide open, waiting for a rescue that will never come, because we have decided it is more important to believe in transformation than to acknowledge termination. This is the final lesson of Pinocchio. We are not the woodcarver who creates life from dead wood. We are not the fairy who grants wishes. We are not even the puppet who dreams of becoming real. We are the fox and the cat, and we have convinced ourselves that we are the heroes of the story. We have made our peace with the hanging because we have made it invisible, wrapped it in enough layers of revision and sanitization that we can sleep peacefully while the puppet still swings in the wind of our collective unconscious. The greatest magic trick ever performed was not bringing a wooden puppet to life. It was making an entire culture forget that we killed him, and then teaching our children to celebrate the lie, and our punishment is that we have forgotten how to recognize ourselves in the mirror.